Hey, and welcome back to MattyB's Flowing Tips for Beginner Debaters. In this part, we're more going to talk about sort of how debates happen and what that means for the flow. And I'm going to be spending some time also talking about sort of the role of each of the speeches and how to proceed throughout the debate. And we're specifically going to be talking mostly about public forum and Lincoln Douglas. However, once again, these lessons are going to be absolutely applicable for big questions in policy debate. There's me again, and if you're curious about that picture, just go watch the first video. In fact, if you haven't watched the first video, and if you haven't gained some familiarity by watching multiple debates and trying to flow what happens, then you're going to be really confused in this video. So definitely have some familiarity with debate before we get started here. Okay, so flowing throughout the debate. As sort of a golden rule of debate in general is that every speech after the constructive speech, so in the case of public forum, that would be the rebuttal, the summary, and the final focus. And in Lincoln Douglas, there's multiple rebuttals. In policy, it's the same thing. There's multiple rebuttals. On big questions, there's different names for it. But it's all the same essentially, which is that every speech after the constructive, the role of every speech is to respond to what your opponent just said. And every response must be flowed immediately to the right of the argument being responded to. So we saw in the previous video about how flows generally develop from left to right, and it's a top-down thing as well, where there's arguments, different types of arguments from the top to the bottom, and then as those arguments are responded to in sort of a tennis match, you know, you can imagine every argument is a tennis ball being hit by both sides back and forth throughout the debate. And that's what happens from left to right on the flow. So in terms of the flow itself, you should be keeping things fluid and open to change. So debate is a dynamic process. No two debates are the same. And keeping things fluid and open to change is really important because debate happens in the moment. And the best speeches are made in the moment. So I recommend not drawing more than one vertical line. For instance, and we talked about this in the last video, how I had the dashed lines to represent those the speeches after the constructive speech. That's because I don't draw the line there. I try to put things into a column, but that doesn't always happen, and things overflow. You know, that's just the nature of debate. So anything you can do to sort of keep the structure pretty loose is important. And also using the space however you need it. So don't get intimidated by the page. Use it to your advantage to write down whatever it is you need. Again, even if it's not something you're going to say. So the flow again is your flow. It doesn't, you know, you're not going to show the judge the flow. So however you need to use that space on the page is however you should be using it. And let's remember once more that the most important thing is knowing what you're going to say in your next speech. So knowing what you're going to say is the primary advantage of flowing. But at the same time, you don't need to have a perfect flow. The perfect flow is secondary to knowing what it is you're going to say. So this is the structure of a public forum debate. This is how the debate proceeds. If you're a public forum debater, memorize this. You will definitely memorize it after doing a few debates. But let's go through this. So in this case, the affirmative speaks first. This isn't always the case. Public forum is unique in the fact that there's a coin flip sometimes to determine whether the affirmative is the first constructive speech or whether the negative does the first speech. And that determines the speaking order for the rest of the debate. So in this case, the affirmative, let's say that the negative won the coin toss and they wanted to speak second. Now the affirmative speaks first in every single part of the debate, the constructive, the rebuttal, the summary, and the final focus. So what happens? The first affirmative speaker gives the constructive speech, and that's a 4-minute speech. Then the first negative speaker gives their constructive speech. Then there's a crossfire, a questioning period between those two speakers. Then the affirmative second speaker, so public forum, remember, is a 2-person debate. So the second affirmative speaker gives the rebuttal. Then the second negative speaker gives the rebuttal for the negative. Then there's a crossfire between those two speakers. Then there's two summary speeches. Again, affirmative first speaker and negative first speaker speak in the summary speeches, and then the final focus is the affirmative and negative second speakers. And the grand crossfire is actually between all four competitors. So, what do you do if you're the affirmative speaking in the rebuttal? Well, remember the golden rule of debate: respond to everything your opponent just said in their previous speech. So that's what the role of the affirmative rebuttal is to respond to the negative constructive. The role of the affirmative summary speech as such is for the negative to for the affirmative to respond to the negative rebuttal, because that was the most recent speech made by the negative. And if you, as the affirmative, have answered both the negative constructive and the negative rebuttal in their entirety, then you're in a really good situation by the time you get to the summary speech, because you've covered every single one of their arguments. And then the same can be said for the final focus, responding to everything the negative just said in their summary speech. The final focus is a tricky speech as well, because you also need to summarize the debate. And so your answers to the negative summary speech are going to be brief. And then you need to summarize the entire debate and talk about, the main issues in the round. So, given that rule that we saw with the affirmative, now we see what happens with the negative. The negative rebuttal should be primarily responding to the affirmative constructive, as we saw with the affirmative rebuttal and the negative constructive. However, the negative, since they are speaking second in this scenario, they can respond to a couple of things or many things said by the affirmative in their rebuttal, because the negative is speaking second, the affirmative just made that speech, and so the negative has an opportunity there to say a few things about what the affirmative just said in the rebuttal. The same is said for the negative summary. So not only is the negative summary primarily responding to the affirmative rebuttal, but the negative summary also can address things that were said by the affirmative in their summary. You see now that there's double coverage on every one of the affirmative speeches, potentially. And it's clear, though, that the negative has an advantage as being second speaker. And then once again, repeating the same pattern. The negative focuses on the affirmative summary in their final focus, but they can also talk about things the affirmative said in the final focus. So this is the complex situation, and it leads to a complex flow. And we haven't even talked about the questioning period. But that's not really something that is done on the flow. So the questioning period happens sort of in the moment. And what I recommend doing if you're a debater is writing down questions that you have if you're going to be the one going up to ask the questions. Write down, write asterisks or symbols to show that this is something you want to talk about in the crossfire. Write that down on your flow, but you don't need to write down everything in the crossfire on the flow. In fact, judges don't usually flow the questioning periods anyway, and that's true of all debates in general. So, how does all of this complexity look on the flow? Well, let's talk about what happens on the flow. Here we see that one of the rules that I suggest doesn't necessarily apply to public forum. And the convention that I suggested was to use portrait orientation for your page. That's sort of the convention that we've been using throughout the first video. But the convention that I recommend using for public forum is actually landscape orientation. So you have the 8.5 from top to bottom, and then the 11 from left to right, because there's going to be a lot of different speeches in public forum. That's not necessarily true for Lincoln Douglas. And we'll see how Lincoln Douglas works after we talk about public forum. But let's get into this. So in public forum, once again, the affirmative might speak first or the affirmative might speak second. In this scenario, once again, the affirmative speaks first. And so you've got your two pieces of paper at the beginning of the debate. And the first thing that happens is the affirmative constructive. Okay? So that happens on the left-hand page, and then the negative constructive happens. Generally, in the negative constructive, No arguments are made against the affirmative constructive. Whew, that's a good thing. And then, okay, so after all that, there's a crossfire, and then the affirmative makes their rebuttal. The affirmative should primarily be responding to the negative constructive, which is why we're going to flow it on the right-hand side there. And then the negative makes their rebuttal. And primarily that's going to be across from the affirmative constructive. However, they might also, the negative, make arguments against the affirmative rebuttal. So there could be some arguments flowed there as well on the right-hand side. So then there's a crossfire, and then we end up with the affirmative summary speech. And the affirmative summary speech is primarily going to be responding to the negative rebuttal. So it gets flowed on the left-hand side. And since the negative might have made some arguments in their rebuttal against the affirmative rebuttal, you end up with potentially some arguments here from the affirmative summary on the right-hand page again. Then it's the negative summary. And the negative summary primarily is going to be responding to the affirmative rebuttal, which is going to be on the right-hand page again. But since there's those two columns in the middle between the affirmative rebuttal and the negative summary, you will need to draw a line all the way across those two columns in order to indicate that the negative summary, the argument in the negative summary is responding to something that the affirmative said in their rebuttal. So drawing that line is going to be really crucial for you to understand the connections between these arguments. Never underestimate the power of the line. Okay, and the negative summary, of course, can also make a couple of arguments against the affirmative summary because, again, the negative is speaking second, immediately after the affirmative. So there might be some arguments the affirmative makes in that left-hand, on the left-hand page against the affirmative summary. Okay, and then we do the grand crossfire, and we end up with the affirmative final focus. And the affirmative final focus is going to be focusing on what the negative said in the summary, which did focus primarily on what the affirmative said in their rebuttal. So primarily, most of the arguments from the affirmative final focus will probably be on the right-hand page because they're going to be talking about the bulk of what was said in the negative summary, which was mostly on the right-hand page. But the affirmative final focus, of course, could also make arguments on the left-hand side because the negative could have made arguments in their summary against the affirmative summary. Okay, so there's one more speech in the round, and it's the negative final focus. There's no way to know whether the proportion of arguments are going to be on the right-hand page or the left-hand page. At this point, it's all mixed up. But we do know that there's a possibility that the negative final focus could make arguments on both pages. So this is what the entire, and then, thank God the debate is over. This is what the entire debate looks like. As you can see, there's a lot of potential for different things to happen, but keeping in mind something really important, which is just a simple rule, which was the second rule on the first slide that we looked at here, which was right here, this slide. So the second thing, every response must be flowed immediately to the right of the argument being responded to. And given that, and given that it will be in an opposite color, that's it. That's the simple rule that gives us that complex picture. And if you're just following this simple rule, then your flow will develop naturally. So more important than having those columns that I just showed you is paying attention to that rule. Every response must be flowed immediately to the right of the argument being responded to. And in the case of where you need to skip over a couple of columns like I showed you, just draw that line, It's that simple. Okay, so we've talked about public forum. Now let's talk about Lincoln Douglas, which hopefully will be simpler. You've got the affirmative constructive, where the affirmative speaker delivers their case. Then there's a cross-examination. Notice that's different from crossfire because cross-examination is about the negative asking questions of the affirmative only. The affirmative cannot ask questions in that CX. Only the negative can ask questions. Then there is a 7-minute speech for the negative, which is divided into the constructive, and hopefully the negative spends some time rebuking the affirmative constructive. What I recommend doing as a Lincoln Douglas debater is actually presenting your case for 4 minutes and then spending the last 3 minutes of your speech doing a rebuttal of the affirmative constructive. That's a short time, 4 minutes, but it's enough to make something happen. And you want to give yourself as much time as possible to do that rebuttal, because you don't have another chance to do a rebuttal until much later in the debate, as we can see from this chart. After that negative speech, there's the cross-examination of the negative, where the negative now cannot ask questions. The affirmative is the one asking questions. And then the first affirmative rebuttal, the negative rebuttal, and the second affirmative rebuttal. You might think right off the bat that the affirmative has an advantage because they can speak first and last in this debate. However, the speaking times are exactly equal for the affirmative and negative, as is true for every debate. And the negative rebuttal there, that 6-minute speech, is brutal for the affirmative because they need to answer everything the negative said in under 3 minutes. And that negative rebuttal there, that 6-minute speech, is a really excellent opportunity as the negative to just, crush your opponent, basically, to make argument after argument after argument, and then summarize the debate. And you have so much time to do that. So I love LD for that reason, because that is a balanced, it's a balanced advantage when you're talking about speaking first and last as the affirmative, and then having a huge rebuttal at the end for the negative. So what does the affirmative do? The affirmative does their constructive. What does the negative do? So what does the negative do? The negative has their constructive, and during that constructive speech, they should dedicate a huge amount of time, at least 3 minutes, to talking about the affirmative constructive speech. Then later on in the debate, the negative rebuttal will answer the first affirmative rebuttal and then summarize the debate. The affirmative only has that first affirmative rebuttal to answer the entire negative constructive case, as well as their rebuttal of the affirmative case. And then the second affirmative rebuttal's role is to simply respond to the negative rebuttal. So it's the similar sort of pattern that we saw in public forum. And again, cross-examination is different because it's not necessarily a dedicated amount of time to make arguments. It's less certain what will happen in cross-examination. And like I said, cross-examination is not typically flowed by the judge. So this is the picture. I'm not going to go through the entire picture like we developed from the start of the debate for public forum, but this is what the flow ends up looking like for the Lincoln-Douglas debate. So you've got the affirmative constructive there, and then the first half of the negative constructive on the right. The second half of the negative constructive should immediately respond to the affirmative constructive. Then you have the first affirmative rebuttal, which should respond to both of those things, not only both halves of the constructive. Then you have the negative rebuttal, which responds to entirely the first affirmative rebuttal. And that means that it's going to be on both pages. And finally, the second affirmative rebuttal is going to be responding to that negative rebuttal, which means also that it's going to be on both pages. So this is a fun debate. Really, this flow is much more simple to me than public forum. And you can see that there are fewer columns and there's a lot more opportunity. I won't make any arguments about which is better, Lincoln-Douglas or public forum. I did Lincoln-Douglas because I loved it, so obviously I'm biased. But yeah, so this flowing and the portrait orientation works really well for Lincoln-Douglas for this reason, because there are very few columns relative to public forum, which could have, like we saw, like 7 or 8 columns. All right, so we see now what happens typically in Lincoln-Douglas and public forum flows. And hopefully you have some ideas about what's going to happen on your flow that are different from these, because this is purely my style. So hopefully you have some ideas about how to make yours different. Now I want to show you what happens actually in practice. So even though I drew out these slides with specific columns dedicated for specific speeches, that never happens in debate. Like I said earlier, debate is a very dynamic thing. Things change a lot in debate. And here in this example, this is a policy affirmative constructive on the left with a negative rebuttal of that case. And then there's an affirmative answer to that, and then another negative answer to that. But it's not in uniform columns. Generally, Later speeches, arguments from later speeches appear more to the right. And it does go from left to right, like that much is clear. But things are squished together. Things are, there's lines to indicate different places because I wanted to give myself more room in certain areas, like the bottom there. It got really squished at the bottom, so I wanted to try to put those arguments from the affirmative in the middle of the page. There are arrows to show extensions, which is something we haven't talked about, but I will discuss in the advanced flowing tips video, extensions. And there's symbols, there's abbreviations, there's all kinds of stuff going on that I understand because I'm the one who made this flow. I'm the one who judged this round. But you probably don't understand because, first of all, you're not my debate partner. Second of all, you're not me. Here is the continuation of that Lincoln Douglas affirmative constructive that we saw in the last video. So it's the lethal autonomous weapons topic. The negative did this excellent coverage on every single one of those arguments on the affirmative case. The negative responded to almost every argument, and then as you can see, the affirmative did not answer all of the negative's arguments there. That's called drop. That's called dropping your opponent's arguments, which is also discussed in the advanced flowing tips video. And then there's arrows there to show extensions, once again, which are discussed in that advanced flowing tips video. It's pretty clear that the negative won this side of the flow. We don't know what happened on the negative side of the flow, but we do know that because the affirmative had pretty poor responses to the negative rebuttal, we know that the negative has a really good chance of winning. And in fact, the negative did win this debate. So, and then at the bottom there, this is actually feedback for the debaters. So as a judge, I will give feedback to the debaters and I will write down things at the bottom there that are sort of out of the way of the flow because I know that generally that space is not going to be used. However, since you are not going to be writing feedback as a debater, don't do that. Try to use as much space as you can because that space is yours to use. But one thing I will say that if you are a debater now, you are likely to be a judge in the future. Developing your flowing skills now is going to help not only you win better debates, but it's going to help you be a better judge in the future. There are so many advantages to learning how to flow really well. And I'm sure that you could even use this style of note-taking in class. And the listening skills that you develop and the ability to sort of think on your toes and make arguments off the top of your head based on little phrases on your page. All of that's going to be really helpful for wherever you go in life. So with that being said, this concludes the beginning tips. And I hope that you continue to watch YouTube videos of debates, practicing your flowing skills, watching how debates develop, and imagining yourself in those debaters' shoes, and then actually going forward and practicing those debates skills. That being said, good luck in your next debate. Thank you, everyone. I'll see you next time.